very delighted to welcome you to the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, where we tell the stories of ordinary Mississippians who challenged America to live up to its ideals. The museum tells the story of a people who endured slavery and the unspeakable horrors of the Jim Crow era, courageous people who risked their lives fighting for civil rights in their communities. The museum itself is a result of a years-long community-driven effort to tell the unvarnished truth about our state's past. Today, I'm going to show you how we tell this important story and why what happened here in Mississippi changed the nation. I'm standing in the first gallery of the museum, Mississippi Freedom Struggle. The names you see on the wall are the heroes and sheroes of the Mississippi movement. They are the focus of this museum. This gallery gives an overview of the African American experience from 1619, when the first Africans were forcibly brought into this country through the end of the Civil War. Throughout this period are examples of African American resistance to their conditions, including rebellions. More than 18,000 Black Mississippians fought for the Union Army during the Civil War, which was fought over the issues of slavery. After the Civil War, a period in American history known as Reconstruction began. That is a part of the focus of the second gallery of the museum. Congress passed the 13th Amendment, which banned slavery, the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to Blacks, and the 15th Amendment, which granted Black men the right to vote. Mississippi had to rewrite its constitution in order to rejoin the United States, and delegates were elected from across the state to draft the document in what is now the old Capitol. This was the first time African Americans were involved in the political process in the state, and what emerged is known as the 1868 Constitution. African Americans began running for political office as sheriffs, city council members, and state legislators. When Mississippi rejoined the Union in 1870, the state legislature elected Hiram Revels to the United States Senate, becoming the country's first African American senator. Later, John R. Lynch would serve as the Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives. This was a period of remarkable achievement. At least 226 Black Mississippians held public office during Reconstruction. This period of success did not last long. Although African Americans had begun to create their own institutions, such as schools, churches, and in the case of Mount Bayou, Mississippi, their own towns, Blacks were systematically removed from the political process. White Mississippians used violence and intimidation to prevent Blacks from exercising their rights. Behind me are monoliths commemorating the known lynching victims through the beginning of the 20th century. Mississippi had the most lynchings in the United States from 1882 to 1968. This was the beginning of the Jim Crow era, a period in which states enforced racial discrimination and segregation through laws and customs. Journalist Ida B. Wells published numerous pamphlets documenting the injustice of lynching. During the 1875 election, Congress abandoned the Reconstruction Project in Mississippi, and whites successfully wrested political control of state government from Black officials through a campaign of violence. Organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan and the Red Shirts prevented Blacks from casting their votes. The number of Black voters in the state would continue to decline through the end of the century. In 1890, the state legislature crafted a new constitution that sought to remove African Americans from the political process. There was only one Black delegate present at the Constitutional Convention. The 1890 Constitution instituted new barriers to Black political participation, such as literacy tests and poll taxes.
This little light of mine,
I'm gonna let it shine.
this little light of mine,
Oh, I'm gonna let it shine.
said this little light of mine,
Oh, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine. Let it shine.
This Little Light of Mine gallery, the heart of the museum. This gallery honors civil rights activists in the Mississippi movement and the light they spread throughout the state. The 37-foot sculpture illuminates the space just as people came from across the nation to Mississippi to join with local people to illuminate a dark period in Mississippi's history. The light sculpture periodically plays the music of the movement. On the walls are the drawings of Tracy Sugarman, a Freedom Summer volunteer who documented his experience in the movement through art. The names and lights are the martyrs of the modern movement. The photographs high above are of some of the local leaders who made major contributions to the movement.
All in Mississippi, I'm gonna let it shine. All in Mississippi, I'm gonna let it shine. All in Mississippi, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Shine, 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 shine. I'm gonna let it shine. Shine, 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 shine. I'm gonna let it shine. Shine, 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 shine. I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine.
This gallery, A Closed Society, examines key events that took place during the years 1941 to 1960. Black Mississippians, such as Medgar Evers, Aaron Henry, and Amzie Moore, returned home from serving in World War II, determined to challenge Jim Crow and to become full citizens. These are replicas of the train cars many of those veterans returned home in. Inside, you can hear these veterans tell their stories. Many Black veterans joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, and the Regional Council of Negro Leadership. They pressed for voter registration, anti-lynching laws, and for ending discrimination in housing and education. In May 1954, the United States Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that the segregation in schools was unconstitutional. Surrounding the schoolhouse are photographs taken around the time of the Brown decision from the state archives. Photos show the stark difference between white and Black Mississippi schools in the same county. Inside, a video tells the story of desegregation in Mississippi's public schools. In reaction to the Brown decision, white supremacists created the Citizens Council in Indianola, Mississippi, to oppose desegregation. In 1956, the Mississippi legislature created the Mississippi State Sovereignty Commission to promote segregation and to spy on civil rights activities. Medgar Evers became the state's NAACP field secretary in 1954. He and his wife Merle organized local chapters across the state, recruited members, and set up youth councils. Within a year of starting his work, Medgar Evers was called upon to investigate the lynching of Emmett Till. A 14-year-old boy from Chicago, Till was abducted and murdered for allegedly whistling at a white woman while visiting his family in Money, Mississippi. Evers investigated the case and helped to bring national awareness to the tragedy. Till's mother, Mamie, held an open casket funeral to, quote, show the world what they did to my boy. Till's murder would serve as a catalyst for young people to join the civil rights movement. The men who abducted Till were never convicted.
The early 1960s saw a new generation of activists who brought a fresh urgency to the civil rights movement in Mississippi. The younger activists were determined to fight inequality forcibly and directly. Bob Moses, an activist with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, described this time as a tremor in the middle of the iceberg, the title of this gallery. As you can see, the focal point of this space is the jail cell, the main source of fear among local people. At the time, there were only 3 lawyers in the entire state who would represent activists: Carsey Hall, R.J. Brown, and Jack Young. African Americans feared getting lost in the system or just going missing. With the encouragement of Medgar Evers, Dr. Gilbert Mason spearheaded wade-ins to desegregate public beaches on the Gulf Coast in 1960. The Tougaloo Nine even staged a read-in at a public library in March of 1960. Sit-ins at the lunch counters took place in Biloxi, Greenville, Clarksdale, and Jackson. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, recruited young people, black and white, to challenge segregated busing. The activists would ride an integrated bus from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans, Louisiana. They became known as the Freedom Riders. During their trip, they were beaten and their bus was firebombed in Alabama. And more than 300 Freedom Riders were arrested here in Jackson, Mississippi. Their mugshots are plastered on the walls on this gallery in their honor. Meet Hezekiah Watkins, the youngest freedom rider who was arrested. He was only 13 years old.
My name is Hezekiah Watkins, and at the age of 13, I was arrested here in Jackson at the Greyhound bus station. Not only was I arrested, I was sent to the state prison, Parchman. While I was in Parchman, I was on death row. At the age of 13, I had no idea those words, death row. Didn't know the meaning, had never heard them before. I was put in a cell with 2 other inmates who was there for murder. And the next morning, they began asking me questions like, why are you here? What did you do? Who did you kill? And I said, I haven't killed anyone. Well, why are you here? I don't know. Well, we all say that. I killed a person, shot him 6 times or something like that. The other guy said, I stabbed a person so many times, had no remorse. And I'm looking at these guys, I'm saying to myself, they can't be real. You know, the story that they're telling me can't be the truth. So later on that day, they began asking me about who was your judge, who was the lawyer. And I didn't have a lawyer. I didn't know nothing about a judge. Only thing I knew about the system was what I saw on TV, which was Perry Mason as a child coming up. And they kept talking, and that's when it really, really began to hit me in terms of what was happening, where I was, and what could happen to me. They beat me, of course. They took my food. They just misused me, just like I was a little puppy dog. And the President of the United States, John Kennedy, had a conversation with the governor of this state, Ross Burnett, and I'm told, I wasn't at the table, but I'm told that the president told the governor he did not want to see what happened in Alabama happen in Mississippi. And the governor assured the president that it would not. Upon ending that conversation, the governor called the correctional institution and ordered my release. And I was ordered back to the police department here in Jackson. And actually, thereafter, when my journey really began, and I went on to be arrested 109 times, so I'm told. Now, I didn't count the times. It could have been 110, could have been 90, but I know it was over 50, it was over 60. But how many times over that, I really don't know. I can only speak for me. I was afraid each time I was arrested because there always was a possibility that this sit-in, this protest, this demonstration or whatever it might be could be my last. And there was guys and girls who would tell you, I'm not afraid. But yes, ma'am, I was afraid each time that I was arrested. And I was more afraid if I saw that Confederate flag. That Confederate flag, and I can't tell you why, but it put more fear in my mind than a police officer holding a gun on me. All of them was called breach of peace. I don't care what you did, whether you was sitting at a lunch counter, whether you was protesting, or whether you was taking someone to the courthouse to register, whatever, you was charged with breach of peace.
Macomb was the site of the first new voter registration campaign in 1961. World War II veteran Amzie Moore sent Bob Moses to Macomb to work with C.C. Bryant, an NAACP leader. Young activists such as Curtis Hayes and Hollis Watkins worked with local people, including NAACP leader Vernon Damer, to expand SNCC's voter registration efforts across the state. SNCC set up an office in Greenwood, Mississippi in 1962 and organized throughout the Mississippi Delta. In June of 1962, James Meredith attempted to register to attend the University of Mississippi, triggering a riot at the school on September 30th of 1962. The violence that took place took the lives of 2 people. Some 23,000 federal troops stood guard over the campus. The next morning, Meredith, escorted by armed soldiers, registered and attended his first class. After midnight on June 12, 1963, Medgar Evers was shot in the back by a sniper outside his home and later died at the hospital. Evers' funeral drew some 4,500 people, and he is currently buried in Arlington National Cemetery. Byron De La Beckwith went free after 2 mistrials in 1964. But in 1994, Beckwith was convicted for Evers' murder and sentenced to life in prison.
Conditions will be improved for Negroes. We want conditions improved for everybody.
1963 and 1964 were pivotal years for the Mississippi movement. Activists began to turn their attention towards the ballot box and electoral participation. In 1963, the first 14 attempted to register in Lexington, inspiring the Holmes County movement. SNCC workers Fannie Lou Hamer, June Johnson, Annell Ponder, and Yvester Simpson were arrested and beaten for attempting to integrate a Winona Cafe. In September 1963, the Council of Federated Organizations, COFO, created to coordinate with civil rights groups across the state, organized a Freedom Vote, a mock election to demonstrate the desire of blacks to vote. NAACP State President Aaron Henry ran as governor, and Tougaloo College chaplain Ed King ran as lieutenant governor. More than 83,000 black Mississippians cast ballots in the Freedom Vote campaign. Over 650 college students from across the country volunteered to work in the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project. Working with local movement leaders and COFO, student volunteers organized voter education classes, taught children in freedom schools, and hosted mass meetings. Here is an original COFO sign from the Neshoba County Project. At the beginning of Freedom Summer, tragedy struck. Corps workers James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, and summer volunteer Andrew Goodman were reported missing by colleagues. Because of their civil rights work, Klansmen murdered the men and hid their bodies in an earthen dam. The murders drew national attention to the conditions in Mississippi, and a film about the lives of these young men is shown in this theater. On March 15, 1964, movement activists created the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, a challenge to the all-white state Democratic Party. MFDP members attended the 1964 Democratic National Convention to contest the seating of the regular state party. It was the stunning testimony of Fannie Lou Hamer that captured the attention of the nation as she described her life experience in Mississippi. The MFDP delegates rejected a compromise offered to the National Party, and despite their achievements, many of the activists left disappointed.
The Black Empowerment Gallery focuses on how the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 energized and empowered a growing number of Black Mississippians to protest, march, and boycott for equality. From 1965 to 1970, marches and acts of protest took place in Natchez, Jackson, Lexington, Marks, Port Gibson, and Hattiesburg. On June the 4th of 1966, James Meredith began his walk from Memphis to Jackson to encourage blacks to vote and overcome fear. On the second day of the march, Meredith was shot by a white gunman. Within hours, the leaders of the nation's three principal civil rights organizations vowed to continue the march. Martin Luther King Jr. of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Stokely Carmichael of SNCC, and Floyd McKissick of CORE. The slogan Black Power was first uttered during what became known as the March Against Fear by SNCC organizer Willie Riggs. Carmichael described Black Power as a political strategy. The march culminated in Jackson on June the 26th, when 15,000 people reached the Mississippi State Capitol. The story of activist and businessman Vernon Dahmer is another powerful story we tell in the museum. Dahmer led the Forrest County NAACP and was a vocal advocate for registering blacks to vote. In 1966, Dahmer and his family were attacked at night by members of the Ku Klux Klan. Dahmer returned fire at the Klan as they firebombed his home and store. He died the next day as a result of the attack. On display in the museum are parts of the family truck that were littered with bullet holes during the Delhi attack, a powerful reminder of the price Dahmer and so many others paid for freedom. African American participation in the political process began to pay off. In 1967, Holmes County native Robert Clark became the first African American elected to the state legislature in the 20th century. More blacks joined him in 1975, and by 1979, 16 African Americans were members of the Mississippi legislature. Today, Mississippi has more black elected officials than any other state in the country. This is a remarkable achievement due to the brave Mississippians who fought in the long struggle for political power in the state.
The last gallery in the museum is titled, Where Do We Go From Here? Visitors are encouraged to reflect on what they have seen and to share with others their museum experience. It is also an opportunity to discuss the challenges that remain. Visitors are encouraged to reflect on how they can be a vehicle for change in their communities. A quote by Osceola McCarty ends the journey. If you want to be proud of yourself, you have got to do things you can be proud of. Osceola McCarty was a washerwoman in Hattiesburg who in 1995 established a trust in the amount of $150,000 to provide scholarships for deserving students of the University of Southern Mississippi. Her quote is a charge to the visitor to be the change they aspire to see in Mississippi and the nation, regardless of age or social status. We hope you enjoyed this preview of the museum, and we hope to see you here in person soon.